Clara Johnson stepped into the high-end boutique, her sneakers pressing softly against the polished marble floors. The store was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that only came with overpriced goods and the unspoken rule that if you had to ask for the price, you couldn't afford it. She knew exactly what kind of place this was, the kind where they sized you up before even greeting you. And from the way the blonde-haired employee at the counter barely lifted his head, she could already feel it. She wasn't welcome here. She had been through this a million times before. The lingering stares, the judgmental side eyes, the fake smiles that barely masked the suspicion underneath. Dressed in jeans and a hoodie, she wasn't exactly dripping in designer labels, but she wasn't sloppy either. Just comfortable. Still, in a place like this, comfort didn't count. Labels did. The employee sighed dramatically before finally dragging himself from behind the sleek white counter. He looked her up and down, unimpressed. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone thick with condescension. Clara nodded, unfazed. "Yeah, I need a—" "You sure you're in the right place?" he cut in, smirking. "This isn't exactly a thrift store." There it was. The assumption, the insult wrapped in a joke. He didn't even try to hide it. Clara exhaled through her nose, pressing her tongue against her cheek. She could already tell where this was going, but she wasn't about to let some minimum wage gatekeeper ruin her day. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied coolly. The employee scoffed but plastered on a fake smile. "Okay, what are you looking for?" Clara didn't even blink. A problem, apparently. A flicker of irritation flashed across his face, but he caught himself. Straightening his posture, he folded his arms as if reminding himself that he was in control here. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but this is a luxury store," he said. "We don't really have anything in the lower price range." Clara tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You don't even know what I'm looking for." The employee let out a dry chuckle. "Come on, we both know how this goes." He gestured vaguely at her outfit. "People like you come in, look around, take a few pictures for Instagram, and leave when you realize everything costs more than your rent." Clara's jaw clenched, but she didn't let the anger show. "People like you." The phrase echoed in her mind, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "Interesting," she mused, tucking her hands into her pockets. "So you're saying you already know what I can and can't afford?" The employee shrugged. "It's kind of obvious, isn't it?" She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that came with warmth. It was slow, deliberate, the kind of smile that meant he had no idea who he was talking to. Before she could respond, another customer, a well-dressed woman dripping in designer brands, stepped into the store. Instantly, the employee's entire demeanor changed. "Welcome to Johnson Luxe," he greeted her, his voice suddenly smooth and polite. "Let me know if you need any assistance." Clara almost laughed. The switch-up was insane. She watched as he practically tripped over himself to cater to the new customer, leaving her standing there like an afterthought, as if she was invisible. Fine. If that's how he wanted to play it, she'd let him. For now. Instead of making a scene, she took her time browsing the store, letting her fingers run across the expensive fabrics, the handbags, the watches displayed behind thick glass. She saw the way the employee kept side-eyeing her, waiting for her to touch something she wasn't supposed to. He wanted her to slip up, to give him a reason, but she wouldn't. Minutes passed and the other customer eventually left, satisfied with her purchase. Clara, still unfazed, made her way back to the counter. The employee barely looked at her. "Done window shopping?" he asked. Clara smirked. "Not quite." She reached into her pocket, pulling out her phone. The employee sighed loudly, already assuming she was about to take pictures of the store to show her followers. "Yeah, we don't allow photography in here," he began, but before he could finish, Clara tapped her screen, placing a call. The moment the person on the other end picked up, her entire energy shifted. "Yeah, it's me," she said, her voice suddenly firm. "I need you to come down to Johnson Luxe, Pine Haven branch. Now." The employee frowned. "Excuse me?" Clara held up a finger, silencing him. She was still on the phone, and from the way she spoke, whoever she called was important. The employee swallowed, suddenly unsure of himself. "Who are you calling?" he asked. Clara smiled again, but this time, there was nothing friendly about it. She didn't answer. She didn't have to, because less than 10 minutes later, the boutique's glass doors swung open, and 3 men in all-white police uniforms strode inside with purpose. The employee froze, his smirk was gone, and just like that, everything changed. The boutique's glass doors swung open with force, and the entire atmosphere in Johnson Luxe, Pine Haven branch shifted in an instant. 3 uniformed officers dressed in pristine white strode inside with purpose. Their polished boots clacked against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the tense silence like a blade. Eric Simmons, the smug employee who had spent the last 20 minutes belittling Clara Johnson, stiffened behind the counter. His cocky smirk evaporated as his eyes darted toward the officers, then back to Clara, who stood there, unbothered, composed, and in complete control. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. His fingers twitched against the counter as he quickly glanced toward the store's security cameras. He hadn't hit any alarms. No one had called the police. At least no one on his side. Yet here they were. And they weren't looking at him, they were looking at her. Clara remained exactly where she was, arms crossed casually over her chest, her phone still in her hand. There was no panic in her stance, no nervous glances, no fidgeting. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting them. The first officer, Captain Daniel Cooper, a broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence, stopped just a few feet away. His sharp eyes flicked between Clara and the employee before settling on her with a respectful nod. "Miss Johnson." Eric's stomach twisted. "Miss Johnson?" The words rattled inside his head as his mouth parted slightly, his breath catching in his throat. The second officer, Natalie Parker, a woman with dark, focused eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, barely acknowledged Eric before speaking. "Everything all right, ma'am?" Eric felt the walls closing in around him. This was wrong. He was the one in control, the one who had dictated who was worthy of respect in this boutique. And yet they, the ones with the real power, were addressing Clara as if she were someone important. "Who the hell is she?" His voice came out weak, almost laughable. Wait, what? What's going on?" Clara finally turned her gaze toward him, and for the first time since she stepped into the store, he felt small. She let the silence stretch, drawing out the discomfort until it was nearly unbearable. Then slowly, deliberately, she took a step forward, closing the space between them. "You took one look at me," she said, her voice steady, controlled, "and decided who I was, what I could afford, how much I mattered." Eric swallowed hard. His hands gripped the counter, knuckles turning white. Captain Cooper's gaze hardened. "Mr. Simmons, how long have you been employed here?" Eric licked his lips, his mouth suddenly dry. 2 years." The second officer finally spoke. "Are you aware of who Miss Johnson is?" He blinked. She's just..." He stopped, because he didn't know. He had never bothered to ask. A slow smirk played across Clara's lips. "This is the best part." And then the hammer fell. "She's your boss," Captain Cooper said flatly. Silence. The words slammed into Eric like a freight train. His knees almost buckled. Clara gave a slow, measured nod. "That's right." His face drained of color. You own this store?" Clara clicked, her tongue. "Not just this store." She tilted her head slightly, amusement dancing in her gaze. "The entire franchise." The air in the boutique felt suffocating. Eric's mind shattered under the weight of his own arrogance. He had treated the owner of Johnson Luxe like some nobody. Clara sighed, a trace of disappointment in her tone. "I was just here to check on operations. But you?" She shook her head. "You made my decision very, very easy." Eric's stomach dropped. Decision? Panic clawed at his throat as reality sank in. "Wait, Miss Johnson, please," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't mean..." She turned to the officers. "Get him out of here." The final verdict, Eric choked. "Wait, no, please." The officers didn't hesitate. Firm but professional, they stepped forward, guiding him toward the exit. "Please, I didn't know. Give me another chance." Clara watched, her expression unreadable, as the doors swung shut behind him. And just like that, he was gone. The boutique fell into silence. The remaining employees stood frozen, their faces pale, their breaths held. They had witnessed the whole thing, had watched their coworker dismiss the owner of the very store they worked in. Now they were the ones standing on shaky ground. Clara exhaled, her voice calm but firm. "I need a meeting with the entire team." The manager, Madeline Brooks, who had been silent this entire time, swallowed hard. Right now? Clara nodded. Right now. Within minutes, the boutique's entire staff stood before her. Some wouldn't meet her eyes. Others stood stiffly, waiting, nervous. They should be nervous. Clara let her gaze drift across them. Does anyone want to tell me why this happened today? Silence. She let it stretch, let them sit with the discomfort of the moment. Finally, Vanessa Reynolds, the young employee who had spoken up earlier, hesitated before speaking. I don't think it's just him. The air in the room shifted. Clara narrowed her eyes slightly. Go on. Vanessa took a deep breath. I've seen this happen before. Murmurs rippled through the group. Clara inhaled deeply. And no one thought to say anything? More silence. Then another voice, a male employee near the front. We just thought that's how things were. Clara exhaled slowly. There it was. This wasn't just one employee's mistake. This was a culture. And she had built this brand to be different. Effective immediately, we're making some changes, she said, her voice sharp, commanding. Every single employee will undergo customer experience training. No exceptions. Some employees tensed. Second, she continued, we will be implementing an anonymous feedback system. If anyone witnesses discrimination, they will report it directly to me. More whispers. If that makes you uncomfortable, Clara said, her voice like steel, you are free to find another job. Silence. This was their warning, and next time, there wouldn't be one. The moment the glass doors of Johnson Luxe Pine Haven branch swung open, the boutique's entire atmosphere shifted. 3 uniformed officers dressed in pristine white strode inside with purpose. Their polished boots echoed against the marble floor. Each step steady, deliberate. Behind the counter, Eric Simmons stiffened. His smirk, so confident just moments ago, vanished. His eyes darted wildly between the officers and Clara Johnson, who stood exactly where she had been, arms crossed, her phone still in hand. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't rattled. If anything, she looked like she had been expecting them. Eric swallowed hard. Something was wrong. He hadn't pressed any security alarms. He hadn't called for assistance. There was no incident that required police involvement. Yet here they were. And worse, they weren't looking at him. They were looking at her. A cold, creeping sensation slithered through Eric's stomach, twisting into tight knots. Who the hell is she? The first officer, Captain Daniel Cooper, a broad-shouldered man with an air of absolute authority, stopped just a few feet from Clara. His sharp, calculating eyes barely glanced at Eric before locking onto her. He gave a small nod. Miss Johnson. Eric blinked. His mouth went dry. Miss Johnson? His chest tightened as the second officer, Natalie Parker, a composed woman with neatly tied back hair, glanced at him for the briefest second before returning her focus to Clara. Everything all right, ma'am? There it was again. That word, ma'am, like she was someone of importance, someone who mattered. A jolt of unease surged through Eric's veins. His confidence, his assumed power, felt like sand slipping through his fingers. His voice cracked as he forced a nervous chuckle. Wait, you in trouble or something? Clara finally looked at him, and that was when he felt it. The shift. The silent, undeniable shift in power. Just minutes ago, Eric had been the one with control, the one smirking, the one condescending, the one who had made her feel small. But now he felt small. He felt like he was the one who had stepped into the wrong place. Clara exhaled slowly, shaking her head, her expression unreadable. She took a step forward. The officers moved with her, instinctively making room as if accommodating someone important. Eric's stomach dropped. Captain Cooper turned his gaze toward him, finally acknowledging his existence. Mr. Simmons, the officer said, his tone neutral but firm. Eric's mouth opened, but no words came out. Clara tilted her head, amusement flickering in her gaze. Tell me, Eric, she mused, tapping her fingers against her phone. What exactly made you think you knew who I was? Eric's throat went dry. He had assumed, he had judged, and he had gotten it completely wrong. Captain Cooper exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Mr. Simmons, how long have you worked here? Eric's voice wavered. 2 years. The second officer, Natalie Parker, arched a brow. Are you aware of who Miss Johnson is? Eric blinked rapidly. She's just... He stopped. Because he didn't know. He had never bothered to ask. Clara smirked. "This is the best part," she murmured. Captain Cooper delivered the final blow. "She's your boss." Silence. A heavy, deafening silence that crushed Eric under the weight of his own arrogance. His knees nearly buckled, his face drained of color. Clara gave a slow nod. "That's right." Eric's breath hitched. You own this store?" Clara clicked her tongue. "Not just this store." She tilted her head slightly, watching him wither beneath her gaze. "I own the entire franchise." The room spun. Eric's fingers clutched the counter like a lifeline. His boss, the owner, and he had treated her like nothing. His chest tightened as reality slammed into him. "Miss Johnson, please," he stammered, desperate now. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't mean." Clara turned to the officers. "Get him out of here." The words hit like a gavel, striking the bench. Eric choked. "Wait, no, please." The officers didn't hesitate. Firm but professional, they stepped forward. "Please, I didn't know. Give me another chance." Clara remained still, watching as the doors swung shut behind him. And just like that, he was gone. The boutique fell into silence. The remaining employees stood frozen, their expressions ranging from shock to fear. They had watched everything. They had witnessed their coworker belittle the owner of the very company they worked for. Now they were the ones standing on shaky ground. Clara exhaled, her voice calm but sharp. "I need a meeting with the entire team." The manager, Madeline Brooks, swallowed hard. "Right now?" Clara nodded. "Right now." Within minutes, every employee stood before her. Some wouldn't meet her eyes. Others stood stiffly, waiting, nervous. They should be nervous. Clara let her gaze drift across them. "Does anyone want to tell me why this happened today?" Silence. She let it stretch, let them sit with the weight of the moment. Finally, Vanessa Reynolds, the young employee who had spoken up earlier, hesitated before speaking. "I don't think it's just him." The air in the room shifted. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on." Vanessa took a deep breath. "I've seen this happen before." More murmurs rippled through the group. This wasn't just one employee's mistake. This was a culture. And Clara Johnson had built this brand to be different. Clara Johnson tapped her fingers against her phone, her expression unreadable. "I always find it funny," she mused, her voice smooth, controlled, "when people like you make snap judgments." Eric Simmons flinched. He knew exactly what she meant by people like you. Clara took another slow step forward, closing the distance between them. "You took one look at me," she continued, "decided who I was, what I could afford, how much I mattered, without even asking my name." The words hung in the air like a blade. Eric's mouth opened, scrambling for some excuse, some way to brush this off, but nothing came out. Clara tilted her head, her smirk growing. "That's the thing about assuming, though." She turned slightly, addressing Captain Daniel Cooper, the first officer who had entered with the other two. He gave a single nod. Eric's stomach dropped. Captain, not just a cop, not security, a captain. The other two officers remained silent, standing firm. They weren't moving against Clara. They weren't there to escort her out. They were there because she had called them. Eric stammered, finally managing to choke out a confused, I don't understand." Clara chuckled, a soft, knowing sound. "Oh, I'm sure you don't." Captain Cooper's voice was calm but unreadable. "We received a direct call from Miss Johnson regarding a situation at this location." Miss Johnson. Again, the name hammered into Eric's skull. His head spun. I think there's a misunderstanding," he tried. She came in and, look, we get a lot of people who..." He stopped himself because he realized how bad that sounded. Clara arched a brow. "Go on." Captain Cooper's gaze hardened. "Mr. Simmons." Eric snapped his head toward him, his pulse pounding in his ears. Yeah? You work here, correct?" Yeah, of course," Eric stammered, his hands now gripping the counter. "But I don't understand why this is happening. Captain Cooper didn't blink. "How long have you been employed here?" Eric licked his lips. His voice barely came out. 2 years." The second officer, Natalie Parker, finally spoke. "Are you aware of who Miss Johnson is?" Eric frowned, opening his mouth, and then froze, because he didn't know. He had never bothered to ask. Clara's smirk widened just a fraction. "This is the best part," she murmured. Eric swallowed thickly. His hands shook against the counter. Captain Cooper delivered the final blow. "She's your boss." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that smashed into Eric like a freight train. His chest tightened, his knees nearly buckled. Clara gave a slow nod. "That's right," she said. "I own this store." Then she tilted her head slightly, her next words slicing through the room. "Actually, I own this entire franchise." The air vanished from the boutique. Eric's mind shattered. His breath came in shallow gasps. "You what?" Clara clicked her tongue, shaking her head. "Should have done your research, huh?" Eric's stomach sank into oblivion. His knees felt weak, his palms damp with sweat. He couldn't even finish the sentence. Clara took a step closer, lowering her voice just slightly. "I built this company from the ground up," she said. "I hired the best managers, trained employees, worked my way into high-end markets. And guess what?" She tilted her head, her smirk turning almost pitying. "I didn't have to dress like money to do it." The humiliation burned through Eric's face, his skin prickling. He felt hot, suffocated. The weight of his own arrogance crushed him all at once. Clara finally exhaled, the amusement fading from her tone. "I was going to let it go," she admitted. "I was just here to check up on operations." She shook her head. "But you—" Mock disappointment flickered in her gaze. "You made it real easy for me to make a decision." Eric froze. Clara turned to the officers. "Get him out of here." The words hit like a final verdict. Eric choked. Wait, what? No, please." The officers didn't hesitate. Firm but professional, they stepped forward. "Please, I didn't know. Please, give me a second chance." Clara watched him with a calmness that made it painfully clear. This was already over. "Should have thought about that before you treated me like nothing," she said simply. And just like that, he was gone. The glass doors swung shut behind him, sealing his fate. The boutique was silent now, except for the lingering weight of the moment, a moment Eric would replay in his mind forever. Clara exhaled slowly, the encounter settling over her shoulders. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even surprised. She had seen this before 1,000 times, in 1,000 different ways. Men who thought they held power simply because they worked near wealth. Men who looked at her, sized her up, and assumed she was less. And now he was on the other side of the glass. Captain Cooper shifted beside her. "Would you like to press formal charges?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Clara glanced toward the door. Outside, Eric still stood, shaking, barely processing what had just happened. He was ruined, and he knew it, not because of some criminal act, but because of his own arrogance. Clara took a deep breath. "No, Tiki." The officers exchanged a look. Natalie Parker raised a brow. "You sure?" Clara nodded. "He did this to himself. That's punishment enough." Captain Cooper didn't argue. Instead, he gave a small nod. "If you need anything else, let us know." Clara turned, offering him a grateful look. "I appreciate it." The officers gave one final glance around the store before heading for the exit. As they left, the remaining employees, the ones who had witnessed the entire exchange, stood frozen. They hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. They had just watched. Now, every single one of them was staring at Clara Johnson. She let the silence linger, stretching the moment, letting them sit in the weight of what had just unfolded. The room was still, the air thick with discomfort. Finally, Clara turned toward the counter. Madeline Brooks, the manager, stepped forward slowly. The older woman who had been in the back during the whole ordeal now wore an uneasy look, unsure of what was supposed to happen next. Clara met her gaze. "How long have you worked here?" Madeline hesitated, then cleared her throat. 7 years. Clara nodded thoughtfully. "And how often do things like this happen?" Madeline flinched. Clara didn't need an answer. She already knew. This wasn't the first time an employee had treated someone like less. It wouldn't be the last. But this was about more than one man's mistake. It was about a culture of people deciding who mattered based on appearances, a culture of employees assuming who belonged based on assumptions, not facts. Clara had built this company to be different. She had started Johnson Luxe with the belief that luxury wasn't about exclusion, it was about experience. Yet even her own stores had fallen victim to the same toxic elitism she had fought against for years. That wasn't something she could ignore. She exhaled through her nose, then looked back at Madeline. "I need a meeting with the entire team." Madeline swallowed hard. Right now?" Clara nodded firmly. "Right now." Madeline scrambled to gather everyone. Employees trickled in from the stockroom, and others set down what they were doing. Within minutes, the boutique staff, the people who represented Clara's brand, stood before her. Clara let her gaze drift across them. Some wouldn't even meet her eyes. Others stood stiffly, nervous, waiting. They should be nervous. Clara crossed her arms. "Does anyone want to tell me why this happened today?" No one spoke. She let the silence stretch, knowing how uncomfortable it made people. She had learned a long time ago that in discomfort, the truth always bubbled to the surface. Finally, a younger woman near the back shifted. She was fidgeting, her fingers twisting together. Then she spoke up, her voice hesitant. "I don't think it's just him." The air in the room shifted. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly. "Go on." The young woman, maybe in her mid-20s with bright, nervous eyes, took a deep breath. "I've been here for about a year," she admitted, "and I've seen this happen before, you know." Murmurs rippled through the group. Clara tilted her head, a sharpness to her voice. "How often?" The young woman hesitated, then whispered, "All the time." More murmurs spread through the room. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted awkwardly. Clara inhaled deeply, letting the uncomfortable silence stretch longer. No one thought to say anything. And then, finally, a male employee near the front cleared his throat. We just thought that's how things were." Clara's lips pressed together. "Management ever what?" The man swallowed, realizing too late that he had said too much. Now he had no choice but to finish. "It's not like management ever said anything against it." A long, heavy pause followed. Clara exhaled slowly. And there it was. She had built this brand with one mission: to change how people experienced luxury. But here, in one of her own stores, that mission had been ignored. It didn't matter that she wasn't on the floor every day. It didn't matter that she hadn't been physically present to enforce the culture she wanted. She had allowed this to happen, and that meant it was her responsibility to fix it. She straightened, her voice sharp, commanding. "All right," she began. "Effective immediately, we're making some changes." Some of the employees tensed. Clara turned to Madeline. "Every single employee will undergo mandatory customer experience training. No exceptions. If anyone refuses, they can leave." A few of them blanched, but Clara turned back to the group. "Second," she continued, "we will be implementing a new anonymous feedback system. Any employee who witnesses discrimination will be able to report it directly to me." More whispers. Clara's expression hardened. "If you're uncomfortable with that, you're free to find another job." Silence. No one moved. No one left. "Good," Clara said, letting the tension settle. "I built this company to be different," she said, her voice unwavering. "I created something that didn't just cater to the wealthy, but to everyone. If you can't respect that vision, you don't belong here." A few employees nodded, some visibly relaxed, others simply stared, still absorbing everything Clara had said. She held their gaze. "This is your warning," she finished. "Next time, there won't be one." Clara turned on her heel and walked toward the back office, leaving her team to sit with the weight of her words. Because the truth was simple. She didn't just fire one man today. She had set a new standard, and now they had a choice. Either they rose to it or they didn't belong. The tension in Clara Johnson's shoulders had started to settle, but the weight of everything still lingered. Today had been necessary, but it had also been exhausting. She glanced at the security feed on the screen in front of her, watching as the employees slowly dispersed. Some were speaking in hushed whispers, while others moved quickly, as if afraid they'd be the next to be called out. Good, let them feel it. Clara leaned back in her chair, letting the quiet of the office wash over her. She wasn't the kind of boss who needed to micromanage every little thing, but she had built Johnson Luxe from nothing, and she refused to let it become just another sterile, elitist brand that treated people like dirt. There was a soft knock at the door. Clara sighed, already knowing who it was before she even looked up. "Come in," she called. Madeline Brooks, the manager, stepped inside. Her movements were hesitant, and for the first time in years, she looked unsure of herself. Clara studied her for a moment before gesturing to the chair across from her. Sit. Madeline obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, and took a deep breath. Miss Johnson, I just wanted to say, I had no idea that... Clara held up a hand, cutting her off. Stop. Madeline froze, the words dying in her throat as Clara's sharp gaze fixed on her. You did know. A flicker of something crossed the manager's face. Guilt. You knew. Clara's voice was calm but unyielding. You may not have said the words yourself, but you saw what was happening in this store, and you let it slide. Madeline lowered her head. Clara exhaled slowly. I'm not looking for an apology, Clara continued, her tone steady. I'm looking for accountability. Madeline swallowed hard. I understand. Do you? Clara met her gaze with quiet intensity. Because if you really understand, then tell me what you're going to do about it. The manager took a deep breath, then spoke, her voice firmer. I'll personally oversee the new training. I'll make sure every employee understands that this store is for everyone, not just the people who look like they belong. Clara nodded, and I'll start hiring based on more than just appearance. Clara leaned back, the silence hanging between them. Madeline hesitated again, then spoke. If I'm being honest, I'd like to go through the training myself. Clara raised a brow. She hadn't expected that. Madeline exhaled, clearly uncomfortable. I never realized how much I'd let slide. I should have done more. Clara studied her for a long moment. This time there was no doubt in her mind. The manager meant it. All right, Clara said, finally nodding. You've got work to do. I expect a full report in a week. Madeline stood, nodding firmly. Thank you. Clara waved her off, watching as she left the office. She didn't fully trust her yet, but at least now she knew she was listening. The next morning, Clara walked into the store unannounced, still early before most of the employees arrived. She wasn't there to check on them. Not yet. Instead, she went straight to the counter, running her fingers along the smooth glass surface, the same glass the employee from yesterday had leaned against, smirking, thinking he had her all figured out. Where was he now? Still standing outside? Or had he already started looking for another job, carrying that same mindset? Not her problem. If he didn't learn something from this, that was on him. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Excuse me, miss. Can I help you? Clara turned, surprised to see the young woman from yesterday, the one who had spoken up, the one who had told the truth when no one else would. Oh, Miss Brooks, the woman blinked, recognizing her now. Clara smiled. You can call me Clara. The woman hesitated, then smiled back, her confidence rising. Clara nodded toward the store. You're still here. The young woman straightened. Yes, ma'am. You didn't quit? Clara asked. She shook her head. Not yet. I think things are going to change now. Clara studied her, the weight of the moment settling between them. After a long pause, Clara finally nodded. I think so too. A comfortable silence settled between them before Clara glanced toward the luxury handbags on the far wall. I need a new bag, she mused. The young woman smirked. Think we can make that happen. Clara chuckled. Good. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. Not just for the store, not just for the company, but for the future of the industry itself. The story of Clara Johnson and her interaction with the employees of Johnson Luxe offers a powerful lesson about accountability and challenging assumptions. Clara, despite being the owner of a luxury brand, is subjected to the same discrimination and prejudice that many others face in society, solely based on appearances. The pivotal moment comes when she confronts an employee who judged her unfairly, assuming she didn't belong in the upscale boutique. This story highlights how prejudices based on superficial judgments can undermine a company's values and harm its culture. Clara's decision to hold her team accountable is an important reminder that leaders must set the tone and create an environment where respect and inclusivity are paramount. Rather than just reacting to one individual's mistake, Clara addresses the root cause, the toxic culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. By implementing changes like mandatory training and an anonymous feedback system, Clara ensures that everyone is held to the same standard of respect, regardless of their appearance or background. The lesson is clear. True leadership involves taking responsibility not only for personal actions, but for the environment you create, ensuring that people feel valued and included. Claire's decision to call out the culture of exclusion is a powerful reminder that leadership is about more than success. It's about the impact we have on the people around us. If you enjoyed this story and the powerful lesson it shared, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment below. Your support means a lot, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a situation like this? Share your story in the comments and let's start a conversation. Stay tuned for more insightful content. Subscribe so you never miss an update.